couple more buttons you may have noticed in 2018 is this S and D option up here. If you hover over them, you're going to see this one is Remember Dynamic Mode. This one is Remember Draw Size. If you want to find these, you can go to Preferences, Draw. You're going to see Draw and Dynamic are going to be right here. So in order to demonstrate this, let's go ahead and go into our tool palette again. We'll go into a plain 3D, drag it out on our canvas, go into Edit Mode. Make sure you make Polymesh 3D, go to Geometry, and hit Subdivide until you get to subdivision level 4, let's say. So with our standard brush selected, we don't need to use Sculptress mode on this. We're just going to demonstrate with our regular ZBrush functionality. We have Z-Add turned on. And if you tap S, that's going to give you a draw size. You can change your draw size right here, or you can hold down the space bar and change your draw size. So if we have standard brush here, we're going to use our standard brush to make a draw size of 104. And then let's say I go to my clay brush. So you can hit B, C, L, and that'll select your clay brush. You can also assign a hotkey to it. You can hold down Control Alt, tap the brush, and then assign a hotkey. So I have my hotkey set to Alt S to standard, Alt C to clay, so I can just toggle between them really quickly. So with clay brush selected, I can now draw this brush, and you're going to see my clay brush is also using a draw size of 104. If I tap S and make my draw size smaller, now it's at my draw size is at 59. I can switch back over to standard, and the draw size stays at 59. Now if I want that to be remembered per brush, let's go ahead and hit undo 4 times. You can turn on this remember draw size per brush, so just toggle that on. And now when I use the standard brush, it's going to be a size of 59. If I switch over to my clay brush, it's still a size at 59. However, I can change this to say a size of 116. Drag that out, and now my clay brush is really big, but when I go back to my standard brush, it remembers that the original standard brush was the size of 59. So let's go ahead and change my standard brush even smaller. We'll say 31, and we'll go back to my clay brush, and you're going to see we're still at 116. So that's pretty cool. It'll remember your draw size on any brush that you have selected. Now, where this isn't going to work is if you hold down Shift, the smooth brush, and Control, the mask brush. If I hold down Control and mask pin with my clay brush selected, and the draw size at 56, and I hold down Control and say change that draw size to 120, my clay brush inherits that draw size. So no matter what happens, my masking brush with Control or my Shift brush with smooth is going to maintain the draw size for my brush. However, you can go into your brush settings here and open up the smooth brush modifiers, and you're going to see the alt brush sizes right here. So we have the clay brush here, so we can use our clay brush at that size. And when I hold down Shift, that is the size that our smooth brush is going to be at. However, you can go into brush here, alt brush size, you can change that to like say 2. And now we can use our clay brush at this size, and then when I hold down Shift, it's going to double that size. So you can kind of dial in relative to the brush size that you have selected for your brush that you're using. Now that we've talked about remember brush draw size, we'll go ahead and turn that off, and we'll talk about remember dynamic mode per brush. So before we turn that on, let's go ahead and drag our undo slider all the way back to where we just had our subdivided polyplane here. And we'll go ahead and keep our clay brush selected. I'm going to change this stroke from a dot stroke to a drag dot and change this alpha to alpha 06. And while we're talking about it, let's go ahead and change this focal shift down to -100. So now what I can do is I can drag out this alpha and create the exact same size as long as my camera doesn't move. However, if I move my camera out and drag this out, you're going to see it's still the same size. And if I move my camera in and drag them out, it's still the exact same size. That's because we have dynamic turned on in the draw size here. So if we double click this, that'll turn dynamic off. And now if I make my brush size small, and I click in here, it's going to set these dots to this brush, but if I zoom in, it's going to make them even smaller, and if I zoom out, it's going to make them even larger. So if you want to have consistent strokes regardless of where you are with your camera relative to the mesh, go ahead and have dynamic turned on, and now you can retain that functionality. So now let's talk about what we can do with this global button, which is remembering whether or not your dynamic mode is on or off. Right now we can turn dynamic on or off globally. We have clay brush with it on, and if I go to my standard brush, you're going to see it's on. If I go to my clay buildup brush, it's going to see it's on. Trim dynamic, it's on. If I double click this, it's off for my clay brush, my standard brush. So if we go back to my clay brush here, you're going to see if we make these dots and we zoom in and then we zoom out, it's global, it's off. However, if I want to remember that per brush, all I got to do is say, hey, turn on remember dynamic mode per brush. And now if I have my clay brush, let's say for my clay brush, I want it remembered, so I'm going to double click dynamic. If I go to my standard brush, it's off. If I go to my trim dynamic mode, it's off. Let's say for trim dynamic, I always want it off. For my standard brush, I want it on. So I'll double click this, and then for my clay brush, I want it on. And now, because it's remembering that I have these on and off per brush, with my clay brush, it's always going to be dynamic. If I go to my trim, it's always going to be off. And then when I use my trim brush, regardless, I can zoom out and trim a bunch, or I can zoom in and trim a little. Not sure why I would want to do that, but just to demonstrate having this remember button available to you in the interface. And in case you didn't watch the previous section where we talked about draw size per brush, you can find that underneath preferences, draw, and then there's your remember draw size, remember dynamic. And of course you can have them both on if you want, both off, or one or the other.